Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Today on Oklahoma Gardening, host Casey Hentges begins looking at all of the great grasses that provide ornamental beauty to our gardens, starting with the annual grasses. We have the simple science of the transpiration stream of plants, and Barbara Brown provides some alternatives to pickling salt in case you run out before the cucumbers are all gone.
We often have grass in our garden, but have you ever thought about creating a grass garden? Ornamental grasses add a lot of value to the landscape with their movement, texture, and even the color they add. Take some time to tour you around the grass garden that we have here at the Botanic Gardens at OSU. While any one of these grasses would look great individually in a garden landscape, we've planted them here together so that you could get a full appreciation for the diversity that they offer. While we have a lot of varieties planted here, this is really just the tip of the iceberg with all the cultivars that are now available on the market. With so many ornamental grasses available to the home gardener, we wanted to really get into it with you guys and showcase them. And so we're going to cover 5 different categories of ornamental grasses. From the prairie to the patio pot, we're going to show you why ornamental grasses are such a staple in the home landscape. But before we get started, I want to cover some of those characteristics that make ornamental grasses so popular in the home garden. If you're looking for something that's drought tolerant, disease resistant, pest free, and easy to manage, most ornamental grasses fit the bill. That alone would be reason enough to utilize these in the landscape, let alone the characteristics they offer, like this amazing color that some ornamental grasses provide. Some have more of an upright habit, while some have more of a weeping waterfall feature that they create with their form. Some work well as focal points at the end of a path, while others look really great in mass. Because most of them have large, strappy leaves, they also tolerate our Oklahoma winds really well, whereas some of our broadleaf plants can look a little bit tattered by the end of the season. Also, because of some of this bold foliage, they can be used next to a pool to give you that tropical flair. As you can see, they come in a range of foliage during the summer, from variegations to this dark black almost foliage. But also in the fall, many of them will turn these bronzy copper colors that will also fade into a red color. The color alone is important, but they also will produce seed heads. Some have these giant plumes where others have dangling seeds. Some stay a modest 1 foot tall. Several ornamental grasses get to be about 3 to 5 feet tall, and some reach as high as 12 feet tall. Regardless of which grass you choose, most are not picky about their soil requirements and can do well in our Oklahoma soils. Also, as far as maintenance goes, they're pretty low maintenance. For annuals, you basically just take them out of the garden at the end of the season and either throw them away or compost them. For perennials, you just give them a haircut late in the winter. So you can see we have a lot of ground to cover when it comes to ornamental grasses. That's why we're going to cover 5 different categories. We're going to look at annuals, perennials, shade tolerant, native, and ornamental grasses that aren't really true grasses. So stay tuned as we dig into ornamental grasses. If you're thinking about incorporating ornamental grasses into your garden, there's something to consider first. Do you want it to be a perennial grass or an annual grass? Keep in mind, perennials come back year after year, and annuals you'll need to replant each spring. Even though you have to plant them each spring, there's a lot of potential that annuals offer. We have one popular annual here that you probably have seen. This is called purple fountain grass. This particular cultivar is called rubrum, and it's a very popular one, both in the landscape and also in containers. This one's often featured in the center of a container as the thriller aspect in the container. Now, what is so nice about this particular one is it gets to be about 3 feet tall, and not only does it have this nice purple foliage, but it also features these purple plumes. So even when your other plants aren't blooming in your container or in your landscape, you've got this nice color to still add to your landscape. Now in 2004, there was a sport that was discovered off of this cultivar rubrum, and it was later named fireworks, and we have that here next to us. This also is an annual. But you can see how it got its name and why it was chosen to go to the market was because it also has even more variegation, so adding more color to your landscape. It has burgundy, hot pink, green, and even white in the variegation. Now it's going to be very similar to rubrum in the fact that it gets to be about 3 feet tall, but again, a lovely plant to add to both your landscape or your containers. Now both of these are Pennisetum setacetum. That is the genus and the species. But I want to show you another Pennisetum that you can add to your landscape. Here we have Pennisetum purpureum, and in our garden here we have two different cultivars. One is called Vertigo and one is called First Night. And both have this extremely bold, dark foliage. Now, in the early spring, they can be a little bit difficult to tell apart, but Vertigo will actually get to a 8-foot height, whereas First Night will stay more at a 4-foot height. So depending on what height you're looking at, that might help you select which cultivar you want. The other thing is, regardless of which one you choose, you're going to get this lovely foliage, which really works well to create that tropical look because of the rich color that it provides. And also, if you want, you can put it in the background of plants to really highlight and allow those other colors to pop in your garden. Now we're going to go down a little bit in scale to what is called ruby grass here. And this is not nearly as bold as the Pennisetums, but also a nice grass. It's got a softer, kind of more of a subtle texture to it with this blue-green foliage, and it really kind of softens the edge of your landscape. So you're going to want to put this closer to the bed edge so that it is showcased a little bit better. But also because of its size, it might be one that you want to add into containers to sort of elevate it and highlight it a bit more. Now this particular one has this blue-green foliage and sort of a light pink plume that will fade to a white color, but there is one that's called pink crystals that will keep that rosy plume color to it. It's almost impossible to walk past ornamental grasses and not want to reach out and grab them, but you want to be careful because with their thin, narrow leaves, they can easily slice your fingers, which feel sort of like a paper cut. If you are interested in planting an ornamental grass and are prone to grab a hold of those leaves, you might as well plant one that will leave your hands lemony fresh. This is called lemongrass, which is an herb and often cultivated in Southeast Asia and used for teas. Now this particular one we have planted here in our herb garden in a container to create a focal point in the center of our garden. Now lemongrass only gets to be about 4 to 6 feet tall, and while it doesn't bloom, when you crush those leaves, it will delight your other senses. This is just a few of the different ornamental grasses that you can use in your garden if you're interested in getting into ornamental grasses but don't want a long-term commitment. scientists agree that water is the key to life. And where you find water, you might also find life. And because plants are living things, water is also critical to the development and growth of plants. One reason is for the transpiration stream. That's right. Did you know there is a stream of water running through plants? No, not a traditional stream with rocks and fish, a transpiration stream. But before we jump into that transpiration stream, we need to talk about a few properties of water. Water is both cohesive and adhesive. Cohesive means that it likes to stick to itself. An example of this is when you see water out on leaves of plants. If those water droplets come together, they stay together. That's an example of cohesive. Adhesive means it will stick to something else, sort of like adhesive tape. An example of water being adhesive is after a heavy rain or the morning dew, you'll often see water particles hanging or clinging to the tips of the leaves. The other thing to know about water is it is known as the universal solvent. A solvent is something that can dissolve other substances. Water is known as the universal solvent because it dissolves more substances than any other liquid. The majority of a plant's water is absorbed through its roots. And because we know water is a universal solvent, any of those nutrients, and including fertilizer that might be in the soil, get dissolved in that water, and that's how it's taken up through the plant. But what causes the water to be drawn up into the plant? For that, we need to talk about capillary action. Have you ever put a paper towel in some water and watched that water climb up the paper towel? This is capillary action. What is a capillary? A capillary is a small tube. And in plants, that small tube is called the xylem. And that's how the water travels from the roots of the plants all the way to the top of the plants. But capillary action will only work so far until it can't overcome the force of gravity. But we know there's some really tall trees, some that are over 300 feet. So how does water get from the bottom of that plant all the way up 300 feet? For that, we need to talk about humidity. The inside of plants has 100% humidity. The outside of plants, unless it's raining, does not have 100% humidity. That moisture is trying to find an equilibrium and will lose moisture out of its leaves through pores called stomata. This evaporation process is called transpiration. On rainy days, the plant doesn't transpire as much because of the humidity outside of the plant. On hot, sunny, dry days, the plant transpires a lot. As that water transpires out of the leaf, it pulls more and more molecules up from the base of that plant, and that's called the transpiration stream. This uninterrupted stream of water molecules moving through the plants is called the transpiration stream. And the cool thing is this is happening in all the plants all around us. The rate at which that stream is traveling depends on how hot or humid the day is outside of that plant. On hot, sunny days like today, that water is evaporating or transpiring out of that plant quickly, which means it needs more moisture around its roots to draw up through the plant. On humid, rainy days, it's not transpiring as much, so the stream is moving slower, therefore, it doesn't need as much water at the base of that plant. That's why you have to water your plants more often on hot summer days. Don't believe me? Try this easy, fun experiment at home. Get a glass of water, just plain tap water, and add some food coloring. Red color often works the best. Mix that up so that it has a nice solution there. Again, water is the universal solvent, so it dissolves that dye. Then get you some celery. If you can find some celery that has some leaves on it, that would be the best. Cut a fresh cut at the base of that celery so that it's ready to absorb moisture. If your celery is slightly wilted, that's okay. It just means it's thirsty. Place your freshly cut celery into the dyed water. Let it set for a few days and you'll notice that the red dye will slowly transpire up to the tips of the leaves as the water evaporates out of the plant. The reason why this experiment works so well is because celery is actually a plant stem. You can see here we've had this one set overnight, and the red water was pooled up through the celery and now has dyed our leaves as the water has transpired out of the plant. You want to make sure that you have plenty of water so that there's enough to completely fill that plant as it's drawing up that water. If you have a celery stalk that doesn't have leaves, you can still see this. Here, we can see those red dots are the xylem, where the water's taken up through the plant, and you can see the red dye has come out the top as the water has exited. Now we did another little example by putting a celery stalk in upside down just to see if it would work. You can see here the red dye was taken up a little bit through capillary action, but because the plant doesn't transpire out of the base of the plant, it did not draw the red dye up throughout the plant. So without adhesion, cohesion, and the universal solvent water, we wouldn't have the transpiration streams that are flowing through all of the plants around us. And that's what makes water the key to life.
Today we're going to talk about salt, particularly as it's related to canning. Now, in general, we recommend canning and pickling salt if you're doing canning because of the ingredient content in it. It's pure salt pretty much. But there's a variety of others, and once in a while you'll be in a situation where you cannot get the canning and pickling salt. Either it's not available in your area, or it's too far to the store, so what are your alternatives? And in order to figure out what is the best alternative, we need to talk a little bit about them and look at them a little bit more closely. Now you can see the canning and pickling salt is a really fine grain. All salt's going to be little crystals, little cubes, and so it's going to be very similar in size. This one's table salt. This one is probably a little bit finer than the canning and pickling salt. But the big difference is what else is in this one. And it depends on whether or not you're using an iodized salt, which we recommend for most things that you're using at home, so that should be the one that you're most apt to have at home, or whether you've got just a regular table salt like this one is. Now, in many cases, you'll find, in addition to the salt that's in there, you'll also find dextrose, which helps protect the calcium silicate or whatever other ingredient is added in order to make it pour when it rains, so that it's an anti-caking agent, it doesn't clump up. Canning and pickling salt does not have that, so that very often you'll find that when you come back to use it the next year, no matter how well you've packaged it, it's turned into a big chunk, and you have to hammer it or bang on it in order to get enough to measure off. Now, if it's not calcium silicate that's in the salt, you may find something called yellow prussiate of soda, which is also known as ferrocyanide, and they call it the first name because they don't want you to know that it's got a cyanide base. It's not something to worry about, even though it does have a cyanide in it. The concept of having the cyanide is bound to the iron, which is the ferrous, and your body can't get to it, so it's going to pass through. So it doesn't matter that it's there. It's going to perform its function, and you'll get the benefit without any of the side effects. It's also dose next to poison, and it's such a small amount that you would have to eat a whole lot of salt in order for it to make any kind of difference whatsoever. So that's the benefit. It's also the reason you'll also find the calcium silicate in place, so that because people tend to panic when they hear it's there. So those are those two types. Now the problem with the anti-caking ingredients is that they can make the pickles or the potatoes or the green beans cloudy because it settles out. And one of the signs of spoilage is cloudiness. And so then you don't know, is it because the salt I used, or is it because of the ingredient in the salt? And that's one of the reasons the canning and pickling salt doesn't have that. And so you don't have to worry if it's cloudy, you've done something wrong and you don't want to eat it. So that's one of the benefits. The other problem with having this is iodine. If you do have iodine in it, it can cause darkening of some ingredients. You probably remember an experiment somewhere in grade school back in the day where you used iodine to make a potato dark. And that same thing will happen in your canned goods. So that's the primary reasons why you don't want to use this one. Now, if you can't use this one, another ingredient that a lot of people have is kosher salt. And if you look here, you can see that kosher salt crystals are substantially larger than the other two we have. And that becomes the issue here. It's also pure salt, just like the canning and pickling salt, but the crystal size is a lot larger, and so you need to compensate for that. So I've got a little experiment over here. We'll get the scale going. And if possible, when you do this, do it in grams because it'll give you a much more accurate reading. So we'll put that on, we'll zero that out. And then this is a third of a cup, a level third of a cup of table salt. Okay, so a third of a cup of table salt weighs 103 grams. Now we want to see what the difference is between that and kosher salt, because if we're going to use equal amounts of kosher salt, we need to know that it weighs the same amount. So let's see what happens when we do that. We're losing a few crystals, but not enough to make up for that amount of difference. So in order to get up to the point where we would need to be at 103 grams, we're going to have to add substantially more salt to that. So let's see what happens when we go ahead and add more salt, and exactly how much more salt we'll have to add in order to get up where we need to be. A little bit too far, but you can see it's quite a bit more. So if you're going to make the substitution, you need to do it by weight, not by measure. Otherwise, you're not going to have enough salt. Now, if you're making a canned vegetable, no problem. You don't need any salt if you're just doing a canned vegetable. If you don't have the canning or pickling salt, your best choice there is just leave the salt out and add some salt later on when you're ready to eat it. If, however, you're doing a quick pack pickle, it's going to impact the texture as well as the flavor. So we'd like to have the salt in there, and you could substitute it, but you need to do it by weight, not by measure. This thing that gets even more complex and more critical is if you're making a fermented or a brine pickle or product food, whether it be meat or sauerkraut or brine pickles, you need to have the exact amount of salt there to make sure that the friendly bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria, their growth is promoted and they produce the acid that you need in order to correctly produce that food and safely produce that food. If you are leaving it out by not putting enough in because you substituted kosher salt, then you're more apt to have spoilage and possibly foodborne illness if you didn't notice the spoilage first. So the amount of salt you use is very critical. Now, if you look at the other salt that I have here that would be an option that some people would use, what might be sea salt. And you can see here, again, large crystals. So you could make that substitution, but you'd have to do it by weight, not by volume. The other problem with sea salt is it has more, they're all in small amounts, but it has more of some minerals, so it can change the flavor. And it may also have some problem with discoloration because there may be some iodine in there, as there is in some of the others, or some other minerals that will cause some discoloration. The last salt that I have is one that you will not use, and that's rock salt. It's not an edible salt. It has a lot of impurities. We use it to make ice cream and maybe to melt some ice on the street if you don't have salt for melting ice on the street specifically for that purpose. It'll do it for you, but it's not for eating. So those are the basics of canning salt. You can make substitutions if you have to. Choose a pure salt like kosher salt. It's going to be preferred over table salt. Table salt will work if it's not iodized. You're going to have to preferably use the canning and pickling salt, but there are some options out there for you. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.
There are lots of great horticultural events this time of year. Be sure and consider these activities when you're making your plans for the weeks ahead. Next week, Casey will look at some vivacious vitex for the landscape. We'll have ornamental grasses with multi-year staying power. Casey will cut and dry herbs, and Barbara Brown will have a safe method to infuse oil with herbs. We wish you health and wellness, and we'll see you next week for more Oklahoma Gardening. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shop, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and the Tulsa Garden Club.